Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. Before we do that, I want to talk about the two different ways we can use to control the body. And these two different ways are dependent on whether or not the control is voluntary or involuntary. Voluntary control is exerted by the somatic nervous system, and mostly it involves controlling skeletal muscles. Involuntary control is achieved through the autonomic nervous system, which is also known as the visceral nervous system. And mostly the autonomic nervous system is controlling smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, but it can also be controlling glands. Some skeletal muscle can be influenced by the autonomic nervous system. An example of this is the diaphragm, which can be controlled consciously, in other words voluntarily, or involuntarily, which would be subconsciously. Autonomic comes from the term autonomy, meaning independence. What this means is that there's no conscious thought that's required to run this division of the nervous system. The control centers for the autonomic nervous system are located in the brain. In the hypothalamus, the brainstem, specifically medulla oblongata and pons, and also the cerebral cortex. These autonomic nervous system control centers send signals out to effectors. Effectors are just the generic term we use to talk about the target organs for the ANS. These are involuntary organs such as the heart, lungs, bladder. Sometimes these are referred to as viscera, and that's where the term visceral nervous system comes from. The signals coming out of the brain have to travel either along cranial nerves to the target organ, or they have to travel down the spinal cord and out spinal nerves to the target organ. These control centers in the brain are influenced by subconscious sensory input. So we don't realize it, but right now things like our bladder and our stomach are sending sensory information to our brain, and then our brain is responding by sending signals out to those organs. Now let's take a look at some structural features of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system uses a two motor neuron chain to reach the involuntary organ that it's trying to control. Neuron number 1 is called the preganglionic neuron and is colored green in the picture here. Neuron number 2 is called the postganglionic neuron, and it's colored purple in the picture here. The job of neuron number 1 is to communicate with neuron number 2 at a synapse. So neuron number 1 will release neurotransmitter that is picked up by neuron number 2. This synapse will be found inside a structure called an autonomic ganglion, and that's where the terms preganglionic and postganglionic neuron come from. The cell body of the preganglionic neuron is always located in the central nervous system. This can be either in the brainstem or the spinal cord. The axon of the preganglionic neuron reaches out to the autonomic ganglion, where we find the axon terminal. The axon terminal always releases the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. The cell body of the postganglionic neuron is located in the autonomic ganglion, where it's picking up this released acetylcholine. Don't forget, a ganglion is just the term used to describe a group of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. The axon of the postganglionic neuron reaches out to the involuntary organ, where we find the axon terminal, and this axon terminal can either release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine or norepinephrine. We'll talk more about these different neurotransmitters later. There are two different subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system: sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic division is also known as the fight or flight division. It's your emergency autonomic nervous system division. The job of the sympathetic division is to increase involuntary organ activity, except for your digestive organs. So it's going to increase your heart rate, increase blood pressure, increase respiratory rate, but it will decrease digestive system activity. If this is an emergency situation and you have to either fight or run, it's probably a bad time to use your digestive organs. So that's why it turns those off. The parasympathetic division is just the opposite. Like a parachute, it slows you down. We also call this the rest and digest division. So it decreases most of your involuntary organ activities, except for the digestive organs, which are increased. Because when you're resting, that's a good time for you to digest your food. Let's take a closer look at the sympathetic division. So it still uses the two neuron chain that I mentioned earlier, the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron. The cell body of this preganglionic neuron will be found specifically in the thoracic or lumbar region of the spinal cord. The axon of this neuron is very short because it just has to reach out to autonomic ganglia, which are found right next to the spinal cord. These special autonomic ganglia here are called the sympathetic chain ganglia or the sympathetic trunk. At the autonomic ganglion, the axon terminal of the preganglionic neuron will release acetylcholine. That acetylcholine is picked up by the postganglionic neuron, whose cell body is found in the sympathetic trunk. The axon of this neuron is very long because it has to reach all the way out to the target organ, which could be the bladder or the stomach or the intestines or the heart. The axon terminal releases normally norepinephrine onto the target organ, though there are exceptions to the norepinephrine rule. Under most circumstances, the norepinephrine will increase the activity of the organ. So this again goes back to the idea that the sympathetic nervous system tends to increase most body activities except for digestion. It decreases. So norepinephrine will increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, it will increase respiratory rate, but it will decrease digestive system activity. In this picture here on the left, we can see the sympathetic chain ganglia going down the sides of the spinal cord. So these are the autonomic ganglia used by the sympathetic nervous system. We can see that extending out from the sympathetic chain ganglia, we have the axons of our postganglionic neurons, which are for the most part reaching out to the organ. At the organ, these postganglionic neurons tend to release the hormone norepinephrine, though as I said, there are exceptions to that rule. Norepinephrine tends to increase the activity of these organs except for digestion. So now let's take a closer look at the parasympathetic division, that rest and digest division. Again, it uses a 2-neuron chain. The preganglionic neuron, however, has a cell body found in the brainstem or the sacral region of the spinal cord. The axon of the preganglionic neuron is very, very, very long, reaching all the way to the autonomic ganglia, which here are called terminal ganglia because they're found embedded in the target organ itself. So basically, the preganglionic neuron is reaching all the way out to the target organ because that's where the autonomic ganglion is. At this autonomic ganglion, the preganglionic neuron's axon terminal will release acetylcholine. The acetylcholine is picked up by the postganglionic neuron, the cell body of which is found in the terminal ganglia. The axon of the postganglionic neuron is very, 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 very short because we're already in the target organ and it doesn't have to reach very far to reach out to the target organ. The axon terminal normally releases acetylcholine onto the target organ, which in most cases will decrease the activity of that organ. In the picture on the left, you can see how the parasympathetic division is utilizing the brainstem and sacral regions of the spinal cord. That preganglionic axon reaches all the way out to the target organ where the terminal ganglion is located. Because we're already in the target organ, the axon of the postganglionic neuron is very short and it will release acetylcholine typically onto the target organ, decreasing the activity of the target organ. Maybe you've had this procedure done at the eye doctor's before. Right? This is called mydriasis, and it's pupillary dilation. This can be performed with a drug called phenylephrine. Phenylephrine binds to the same receptor as norepinephrine, giving the results seen below. Based on this, do you think that the pupillary reflex, in this instance, pupillary dilation, is sympathetic or parasympathetic? Pause the video and think it through, and then when you're ready, replay to see if you have the answer correct. The way I would approach this question is by examining the fact that phenylephrine binds to the same receptor as norepinephrine. We know that norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter that's released by the postganglionic sympathetic neuron. Therefore, we can assume that the pupillary dilation reflex must be sympathetic in nature. In this picture here, we see a plant called Nightshade or Belladona, and it has what looks like some very yummy berries, but I do not suggest that you eat them. These berries and the rest of the plant contain an anticholinergic compound. Cholinergic refers to acetylcholine, so anticholinergic means that it stops the action of acetylcholine. What effect do you think Nightshade has on the autonomic nervous system? Again, pause the video while you think the answer through, and then play it to hear the answer when you're ready. Well, considering that Nightshade is anticholinergic, we know that it will be affecting acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is released by the preganglionic neurons of both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Additionally, acetylcholine is typically released by the postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system. I think the most important thing here to realize is that basically the whole autonomic nervous system is going to be affected by this because of the action at the preganglionic neurons. So basically, this can shut down your autonomic nervous system, which sounds pretty dangerous, and it is. Now let's take a look at a special case of the autonomic nervous system involving the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys, and the adrenal glands have two main parts, an outer cortex and an inner medulla, and both of these produce hormones. The cortex produces a series of hormones that are derived from steroids, and they include hormones like cortisol and glucocorticoids. The adrenal medulla secretes adrenaline, which is really a combination of two hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Most of what's in adrenaline is the epinephrine, not norepinephrine. So it turns out that the adrenal medulla is innervated by sympathetic preganglionic neurons. So the sympathetic preganglionic neurons reach out to the adrenal medulla, and they can stimulate the cells of the adrenal medulla to release adrenaline. So there really is no postganglionic neuron here. Instead, there are special cells in the adrenal medulla which are acting like the postganglionic neurons, and they are releasing the adrenaline, which will go into your bloodstream. And of course, adrenaline will do things like increase your heart rate and increase your respiratory rate and increase your blood pressure, and all of that makes sense because we know that in the sympathetic response, we're going to have all those things be increased. The last thing we're going to talk about in this video are autonomic nervous system reflex arcs. So we studied a reflex earlier in the semester. Somatic reflexes, which include things like the knee-jerk reflexes, involve skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system can regulate your involuntary organs through circuits that resemble the reflexes described when we studied the sympathetic nervous system reflex arc. The main differences include the fact that the autonomic nervous system effectors are cardiac and smooth muscle as well as glands instead of skeletal muscle. Also, the autonomic nervous system sensory input can stimulate either a short or a long reflex. The sensory neuron can either project to the central nervous system, which would be the long reflex, or it can skip the central nervous system entirely and go to an autonomic ganglion instead. This is different than the somatic reflex. Somatic reflexes always involve the central nervous system. It could be the spinal cord or the brain, but it always involves the central nervous system. So with this autonomic nervous system reflex arc, we can skip the central nervous system if we go through the short reflex arc. Let's take a look at what this autonomic nervous system or visceral reflex arc looks like. So a sensation is detected by a sensory cell. That sensory cell sends a signal towards the spinal cord. The signal has to travel through the dorsal root and dorsal root ganglion, and there'll be a synapse in the gray matter, specifically the dorsal gray matter of the spinal cord. Here, a motor neuron will then send a signal through the ventral root over to the autonomic ganglion, and then from the autonomic ganglion, the signal will be sent to the target organ. So this is called a long reflex because we are using the central nervous system to integrate the information. The short reflex, however, completely skips the central nervous system and instead uses the autonomic ganglion as the center for the reflex. So in the picture at the bottom, again, we see the sensory receptor detecting the sensation. A signal is sent not to the spinal cord, but to the autonomic ganglion, where we have a synapse with a motor neuron, and this motor neuron will then send a signal to the target organ. So these are very similar, like I said, to the somatic reflexes.